Hello, and welcome back to American Environmental History. This will be Chapter 10, Wilderness and Country Life. So last time I talked about city life. This time I'm going to talk about country life. In this chapter, we're going to examine the actions of 19th century Americans with respect to the environment and the ways that their ideas about wilderness and about life in rural America influenced their actions. So let's get started. So as I've discussed earlier, until quite recently, most Americans lived on farms and worked on farms to feed themselves. Or they lived in villages or in small towns surrounded by the countryside. The idea of a vanishing American wilderness developed at about the same time and for similar reasons as concern about country life. During a period when most American intellectuals and political leaders lived in cities and had lost a daily personal connection with their environments. While their interest in the land and in the lives of rural people was usually genuine, the privileged urban lifestyles of these people, who later became known as progressives, often colored their thinking about the wilderness and about life in the country. So today we're going to look at some of the ideas about nature and life in rural America that have helped shape public policy and have shaped our own understanding of the environment in modern America. So as we've seen earlier, farmers and trappers and lumberjacks and other people working on the frontier were parts of a global commercial network from the very beginning of European activity in the Americas. But new technologies like steamboats and railroads and rolling mills upset relationships between producers and consumers in this global commercial web. During the 19th century, for example, American farmers increasingly found themselves negotiating not with local people who ate their food, or even with local millers or grocers, but with highly capitalized, well-financed industrial mills or stockyards or food manufacturers. When many small producers negotiate with just a few large buyers, the buyers tend to have most of the power in that negotiation. The economic power of the corporations, who were their suppliers and their customers, was not the only problem facing farmers. Railroads had been built with government loans and with generous grants of public land and became the farmers' only choice for transporting their produce to markets in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis. Although heavily subsidized, the railroads were run as private for-profit corporations, and they were allowed to manage their own schedules and to set their own prices. When farmers discovered that big corporations, including the food processors that they sold their harvests to, were paying the railroads much lower freight rates than they were, they felt that they had been betrayed not only by the railroads, but by the politicians that they believed the railroads controlled. Following the end of the Civil War in 1865, a new wave of migration began, and thousands of families moved westward to farm the states of Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakota Territory. The population of Kansas, for example, grew from about 365,000 to over 1 million in the 1870s, and Nebraska also tripled in size. Unfortunately, grain markets did not offer these new farmers the lucrative opportunity that they had anticipated. A short post-war recession lasting from 1869 to 1870 was followed by a much bigger Panic of 1873, and then by what was called the Long Depression of 1873 to 1879, which until the 1930s was actually just known as the Great Depression. Prices for farm commodities were driven down and remained low for decades. And facing increased competition in commodity markets and continuing high rates from the railroads, the farmers looked for a way to improve their chances of financial success. Farmers were well aware of the numerical advantage that they had over railroad capitalists and corporate shareholders. And so they organized to turn their numbers into political power. The Knights of Labor one of America's first unions to open its membership to workers outside of a particular trade or specialty, was organized in 1869 to promote the ideal of unity for all producing groups. Agricultural organizations, including the Granger movement, which produced this image as well as the one on the previous slide, were formed, and the Farmers Alliance and also the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union all combined in 1875 to form the Farmers Alliance. And then in 1890, the Farmers Alliance joined with the Knights of Labor and formed the People's Party. The People's Party, which is also known as Populists, was ultimately unsuccessful in its attempt to establish a permanent third party and put an end to the two-party system in American politics. But populist ideas and proposals influenced the policies of both parties. The People's Party platform called for a graduated income tax. It called for direct election of senators. It called for civil service reform, an 8-hour workday. Many populists also advocated for government control of so-called natural monopolies, such as railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. These services were provided by the public sector in nations throughout Europe, the populists argued. And they were provided by European nations often more efficiently and equitably than they were provided by corporations in America. So although the People's Party did not convince the majority of American voters to support their causes directly, their observations about the efficiency and the quality of publicly provided services like European railroads are just as valid today as they were when they were first made. So although many populists came from rural backgrounds, they took full advantage of the travel and communication opportunities offered by the age of technology. For example, Albert May Todd was a Michigan farmer's son who built an international business in the last quarter of the 19th century, processing and marketing peppermint oil. This is one of the guys that I wrote my PhD dissertation on. So he was based in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Todd established several large-scale farms with their own company towns and agricultural research stations. And one of them, Campania Farm, is pictured here. This is actually a label from one of his peppermint oil bottles. So Todd was based in Kalamazoo, and the A.M. Todd Company became a world leader in peppermint oil. And then its owner decided to try his hand in politics. Like Robert Owen, who you might recall was the guy who had established the textile mills in New Lanark and then had gone on to create a utopian socialist community in Indiana. Todd was both a successful capitalist and a very committed socialist. He financed community centers in his rural company towns where workers could hold meetings and enjoy concerts and dances. Todd visited Europe regularly to promote his business, but he also devoted a great deal of his time to studying European politics, especially events like the Swiss referendum that nationalized the country's railroad system in the 1890s. Todd was also an art lover who brought paintings and sculptures back from Europe that he donated liberally to libraries and colleges and even to the public schools in Kalamazoo. Todd was elected to Congress in 1896, and he spent his time in Washington arguing against the corrupting influence of monopolists, and especially railroads, on American government. Later, Todd founded the National Public Ownership League to advocate for municipal ownership of public utilities and for nationalization of the railroads. Members of the League's board of directors and vice presidents of the board included a former governor of Illinois, the president of the United Mine Workers Union, and Chicago social reformer Jane Addams, who we talked about last week. The activities of rural Americans like Albert Todd show that the ideas of populist reformers were often influenced by the most inclusive national and even international networks. Rural reformers had as much access to information and often had as much influence as their urban counterparts. Populist issues were gradually adopted by mainstream politicians, which drew many members of the People's Party back into the two major parties. Populists would be given credit later for the fact that nearly all of the proposals of the People's Party platform were later adopted by the two major parties and passed into law. Unlike the People's Party, the Progressive Movement, which tried to merge populist ideals of social justice with a celebration of scientific and social progress, was led to a much greater degree by urban intellectuals, such as New Yorker Theodore Roosevelt and Princeton University President Woodrow Wilson, both of whom, of course, became presidents. Progressives expressed their concern for America outside the cities primarily through conservation and agrarian reform. America's early conservation movement sprang from a growing appreciation of nature, especially among people whose lifestyles separated them from the natural world. At the beginning of the 19th century, a Prussian aristocrat and scientist named Alexander von Humboldt, who I've mentioned earlier, traveled throughout Latin America, collecting impressions and data that filled hundreds of articles and books, and made Humboldt one of the most famous men of his time. In 1804, Humboldt stopped in Washington on his return from the Andes, where he's pictured here in Ecuador, to talk with President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had recently completed the Louisiana Purchase, and he was curious about the conditions in the Spanish colonies that Humboldt had visited, in addition to just sharing an interest in natural science. When Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the Northwest, he specifically directed them to collect scientific data like Humboldt had about the plants and the animals that they encountered. And this was partly because Jefferson believed that detailed knowledge of the region would help support American claims on the territory, but it was also because he was genuinely interested in what they were going to discover. This interest in nature spread to the arts, and you've seen this image before. When British-born painter Thomas Cole became well known in the 1830s for a style of romantic landscape painting that became known as the Hudson River School, although this river here is the Connecticut River, and it's just outside of Northampton, Massachusetts. Cole and his students painted not only scenes from the local countryside, but also natural monuments like Niagara Falls. The falls were an inspirational destination for a lot of European travelers in America. Just as Americans went to Europe to see art and culture, a lot of Europeans came to America to see nature. And as transportation improved, growing numbers of Americans made these trips as well. Thomas Cole and several of his students painted the falls, and many of them then traveled west to find new heroic vistas to paint. In the early 1860s, German-American painter Albert Bierstadt journeyed west with a survey expedition to paint the Rocky Mountains and then also paint the Sierras. And his paintings, and those of other artists like California natives Thomas Hill and William Keith, were reproduced as illustrations in popular magazines and in travel guides. For many Easterners, the Western frontier became kind of an ideal land of unspoiled beauty, imagined from these romantic depictions. A big element of this was Yosemite Valley in the California Sierras, which was first painted in 1855 by a San Francisco artist named Thomas Ayres, who had moved to California in 1849 during the gold rush. In 1856, San Francisco's newspaper, the Daily Alta California, carried Ayres' account of what he called a trip to the Yosemite Valley. The article generated a lot of interest in the region as kind of a scenic destination, and Ayres returned to Yosemite and produced sketches that he showed at the American Art Union in New York City. On his return trip to California, where he had to go around the Straits of Magellan in South America. Ayer's ship sank, and he and all his sketches were lost. But American leaders, including Abraham Lincoln, had been influenced by Ayer's, and then were continued to be influenced by other artists and representations of the West. So in 1864, Lincoln signed the Yosemite Grant, giving the region to the state of California as a park for, quote, public use, resort, and recreation. Frederick Law Olmsted, the architect who had designed Central Park in New York City, was appointed chairman of the park's Board of Commissioners. During the Civil War, Montana Territory Governor Thomas Francis Marr and railroad financier Jay Cooke suggested that the Great Geyser Basin should also be protected. So in 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the act that created Yellowstone, the first national park. In 1891, at the urging of preservationist John Muir, Yosemite joined Yellowstone as a national park. And in 1903, Theodore Roosevelt camped with John Muir at Yosemite's Glacier Point. And that's an image from that trip of Glacier Point with the Yosemite Falls in the background. So today we think of Yellowstone and Yosemite as grand refuges where pristine wilderness has been protected for future generations of Americans. But like many other American frontiers discovered since Europeans arrived in the New World, the national parks were already occupied when white men first arrived at them. John Muir's Sierra Club actually pressured the U.S. government until Army troops finally removed the Indians from Yosemite. Muir believed that they had no place in the landscape. And those are his words. Muir's vision of the park as what he called a mountain mansion where nature has gathered her choicest treasures didn't include these people that he called such debased fellow beings. In Yellowstone, park managers used the U.S. Army similarly to evict resident Indians, declaring, "We know that our right to the soils as a race capable of its superior improvement is above theirs." And that was a typical attitude that Europeans had toward America. But in addition to removing Indians from the national parks, progressives waged war on poor rural people much closer to home. For example, in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. In 1887, progressive New York Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt and several of his close friends formed a hunter conservation group called the Boone and Crockett Club, which dedicated itself to the preservation of big game. Members of the club preached the sport hunting ideal of what they called fair chase, and they opposed hunting for food or hunting animals that would then be sold as food, which they called market hunting. In 1900, the club helped pass the Lacey Act, which outlawed market hunting and prohibited the sale of wildlife, fish, and plants that had been, quote unquote, illegally taken. Rural people who had hunted and fished and gathered wild plants to feed their families and who had occasionally sold surplus game before it spoiled were designated as poachers and were prosecuted. While the regulations may have helped to prevent some game populations from being overhunted, that had not been a problem, similar to the situation with the Indians. The Indians hadn't overhunted, and the local rural people didn't really overhunt. The laws also declared that the subsistence practices of rural people were basically illegal. People far from the cities who took animals to feed their families suddenly found themselves being fined or jailed as poachers, while rich members of the club visited the woods to hunt big game and brought trophies home with them from the forests of America and also from, of course, their African safaris. The Adirondacks are a 166-mile wide dome of mountains, about 200 miles north of New York City. The Hudson River begins in the Adirondacks. And although the terrain is very high and gets a lot of rain, it's not very good farmland. But it was ideally situated for wealthy New York sportsmen like Roosevelt seeking weekend wilderness adventures. In 1893, 60 private game parks had been established, containing more than 940,000 acres of the region's best hunting and fishing grounds. Another 730,000 acres was controlled by the state-owned Forest Preserve. In 1894, Forest and Stream magazine observed that, quote, private parks in the Adirondacks today occupy a considerably larger area than the state of Rhode Island, end quote. Wealthy Manhattanites continued buying upstate parcels for estates that they called camps, in spite of the fact that they were the sites of mansions filled with servants. By 1899, the New York State legislature was considering bills that would completely exclude poor people who had lived in the region for generations from hunting in the Adirondacks. Residents had very little influence in Albany, but they knew their way around the local forests. In 1903, after prosecuting several people that he called trespassers and poachers on his estate, a 49-year-old millionaire named Orlando Perry Dexter was murdered by Northern vigilantes. One of the most visible and symbolic battles that didn't end in death between wealthy camp owners and Northern residents was played out in the courts beginning around 1902. A guy by the name of Oliver Lamora, a Civil War veteran living in the Adirondack town of Brandon, supplemented his military pension by fishing and hunting in the woods surrounding the town. Brandon was originally a lumber town, but its fortunes had declined after the best marketable timber was cut. So around 1900, the town's sawmill and the surrounding timberland was all bought by William Rockefeller. He was the brother of John D. Rockefeller. He's a co-founder of Standard Oil, and along with his brother John, was one of the world's richest men. Rockefeller bought out all the Brandon residents who chose to leave, one after another, and he tore down their houses. Within a couple of years, he had removed several hundred buildings, and New York magazines had begun to jokingly refer to Rockefeller as a maker of wilderness. But 14 Brandon families decided to stay and not to sell. And Oliver Lamora was among these holdouts. The problem was, William Rockefeller owned all the land around the town of Brandon. There was virtually no way to leave the town without crossing Rockefeller's land. And anyone who trespassed was liable to be arrested and prosecuted. So in April of 1902, Lamora set out along one of the paths that crossed William Rockefeller's camp. And then worse, he deliberately stopped and fished in the St. Regis River, which Rockefeller considered his personal property. After catching over a dozen fish, Lamora was himself caught by one of the estate's guards, and he was prosecuted under New York State's Fisheries, Game, and Forest Law. So Lamora lived in a little shack in Brandon. Rockefeller lived full-time in this mansion in Tarrytown on the Hudson River in Westchester County, and then had his couple of different camps in the Adirondacks. But Lamora demanded a jury of his peers, and his peers acquitted him. Rockefeller was embarrassed, and he was charged with $11.39 in court costs for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. Rockefeller appealed the verdict and lost. But the co-founder of Standard Oil was one of the world's richest men, and he was not accustomed to being defeated. The New York Times actually remarked that the case was carried from one court to another until a decision was rendered in favor of Mr. Rockefeller. But sympathy for Lamora was strong, and even when Rockefeller won, the jury only awarded damages of 18 cents. In the meantime, Adirondack locals had taken up subscriptions to cover Lamora's court expenses and had begun going out of their way to fish in Rockefeller's park. In 1903, the New York Times reported that Mr. Rockefeller's men have taken the names of upward of 50 persons who were found fishing in the Rockefeller Park. So, although newspapers and magazines like Forest and Stream were critical of the camps and sometimes pointed that out. In one article, Forest and Stream said, Rockefeller, J. Pierpont Morgan, and other landed proprietors in the Adirondacks are only doing with our woods what they have already done with our industries. But even so, wealthy New Yorkers were not prevented from buying up Adirondack land. In 1900, the park's area was roughly 2.8 million acres. About 1.2 million acres of it was state-owned, and the rest of it was private. 100 years later, in 2000, the park had grown to 6 million acres. About 2.4 million acres are now state-owned, and another 600,000 acres are taken up by towns and lakes and small holdings. And this leaves 3 million acres in private hands. Rather than shrinking during what has typically been considered to be a very liberal century, private holdings have nearly doubled in the Adirondacks, until they now take up an area roughly equal to the state of Connecticut. As an illustration that the trend continues, in 2015, Alibaba.com founder Jack Ma bought a 28,000-acre estate, including the Rockefeller camp, the entire town, former town of Brandon, 7 miles of the St. Regis River, 11 trout ponds, and a 2,200-foot mountain for $27 million. If you look at an image on the web, and there are plenty of them, of the United States at night, and you can see all of the lights. If you look at New York State, there's a big circle of darkness up in the north. That is the Adirondacks. In the western states, conflicts over wilderness didn't end when the Indians were evicted from the new national parks. One of the most divisive issues ever faced by progressives focused on a battle between conservationists and preservationists when a portion of Yosemite National Park was proposed as a source of water for the city of San Francisco. Like Boston and New York, San Francisco had grown around its harbor, and the city was surrounded by seawater that its residents couldn't drink. As population climbed in the early years of the gold rush, drinking water was actually ferried across the bay from Sausalito and sold by water vendors. Carts loaded with barrels and horse-drawn tankers would ply the city streets up and down the hills, delivering water to homes and businesses. San Franciscans had dammed most of the small nearby rivers, and they had built the Pilarcitos and the San Andreas reservoirs in the 1860s and 1870s, but the city's need for water kept increasing. And water sources close to San Francisco were all controlled by private companies, which worried city planners. The city of San Francisco wanted to control its own water supply. So plans were made in the late 1880s to look for a new source further away. And in 1901, city water planners decided that the best source was the Hetch Hetchy Valley of the Tuolumne River in Yosemite Park. The Tuolumne River was fed by a glacier in the Sierra Mountains, and it flowed through a very scenic valley 150 miles from San Francisco. To keep their interest in the Hetch Hetchy secret, San Francisco officials filed for water rights in the valley as private citizens. They claimed that this was to prevent speculators from buying up the water supply. And they actually probably had a legitimate concern about that, because it had happened in 1875 when San Francisco had expressed an interest in the Calaveras Valley watershed. So they wanted to prevent that from happening. It may also have been an attempt to keep the project secret as long as possible from wilderness preservationists like John Muir, who by now was a nationally known activist. He had lobbied Congress for the legislation that had created Yosemite Park in which the valley was located, in 1890, and he had founded the Sierra Club in 1892. San Francisco's interest in damming the Tuolumne River reached a new intensity after the earthquake and fire of 1906. The fire destroyed over 80% of the city. Although most of the city's water mains had been broken in the earthquake, many people still blamed the inadequate water supplies for the extensive damage that happened during this 3-day firestorm that followed the quake. Opponents of San Francisco's plan to dam the Tuolumne believed that the valley was too valuable as wilderness to be sacrificed for a city water supply. Critics were also suspicious of San Francisco officials who insisted that a Hetch Hetchy Dam was the only viable plan. In 1907, San Francisco's mayor and his political sponsor were both convicted of graft and corruption for supporting a scheme to have the city buy the Bay Cities Water Company, which was a private corporation that controlled the water sources closer to town. So there was a lot of corruption and a lot of distrust in this. The mayor was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years of prison that he didn't serve, but his wealthy patron was actually sent to San Quentin. Since the Hetch Hetchy Valley was inside of America's second national park, it required an act of the U.S. Congress to approve the dam project. After years of intense lobbying by both sides, dam supporters won the support of Washington lawmakers, and the project was begun in 1913. The Hetch Hetchy controversy forced conservationists and preservationists to articulate and debate their competing visions of how Americans should interact with nature, and especially of how the government should deal with the environment. The arguments supporting the dam were presented by Theodore Roosevelt's chief of the U.S. Forest Bureau, Gifford Pinchot, and the arguments against the project were presented by John Muir. Although the decision was ultimately made to flood the valley, the issues raised by the debates regarding the value and purpose of wilderness have really not yet been resolved. So in addition to difficulty agreeing who wilderness should be for, modern America has also struggled with the basic concept of wilderness. In the first issue of the new journal Environmental History in 1996, environmental historian William Cronon contributed an essay that was titled "The Trouble with Wilderness," or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature. Cronon observed that for many modern Americans, he said, wilderness stands as the last remaining place where civilization, that all too human disease, has not fully infected the earth. End quote. The more we learn of its particular history, Cronon said, the more we realize that wilderness is not quite what it seems. Far from being the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, it is quite profoundly a human creation. When we look at nature, Cronon said, in fact, we see the reflection of our own unexamined longings and desires. Cronon recounted the stories of Indians excluded from the national parks to make them appear more pristine. He talked about the Hetch Hetchy Valley, and he discussed Euro-American cultural traditions and concluded that although we fail to understand that what we believe are wild areas are usually constructed, the connection that we're really seeking is a sense of wonder. Wilderness, he said, gets us into trouble only if we imagine that this experience of wonder and otherness is limited to remote corners of the planet, or that it somehow depends on pristine landscapes that we ourselves do not inhabit. He concludes by saying that even though a tree in a pristine forest might represent a more complicated web of ecological relationships, the tree in the garden is in reality no less other and no less worthy of our wonder and our respect. Nature remains important, Cronon was saying, even if it has people in it. So that's something to think about for today. I will talk more about country life because agriculture and country life are still kind of a big unresolved issue that we're going to deal with this semester. But that's your thought for today. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.